Okay, so we're now going to move on to the next presentation, which is from DEFRA. So this is a joint presentation by Pam Berry and Dan McGonigle. Pam is the DEFRA Senior Fellow in Rural Land Use Systems and also a Senior Research Fellow at the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford University. And Dan is the head of the Systems Research Programme in DEFRA. So Pam and Dan, I think Dan, you're starting, is it? So welcome and over to you.
Fantastic. Well, hopefully this should follow on quite nicely from what James has just presented. I think well, Pam and I are going to give a rather more general presentation in terms of what DEFRA needs out of modelling and the DEFRA group in general. I suppose it's fantastic to see the ARAMP integrated modelling platform in Wales. I just think it's a fantastic tool, and I kind of wish in a way that we had something similar in England that we could call on. We do have quite a good selection of models that we use on a kind of routine basis within DEFRA. I'm not going to go into those in too much detail, rather to sort of talk at a rather higher level about the kind of challenges that we're facing. So just to give you, to step back, I suppose, and just to talk about DEFRA and its role in terms of land use and land management in general, we cover a huge number of topics which have a bearing on land management. And we have a number of different policy teams dotted around the department, all of whom have interests in land use and land management. The red topics here on the slide are kind of policy areas which we have an interest in sort of outcomes which have a direct bearing, or which land use influences directly. And then we have a number of policy levers that we have as well to try and influence the land use and land management system within England. So we've got obviously the agriculture and environment bills which are coming through at the moment, and the environmental land management schemes. This is a huge moving area at the moment for a number of reasons, and particularly due to kind of leaving the EU. At the bottom there, in the bottom left-hand corner, it's worth noting that we're also talking with other government departments, all of whom have an interest in land use in different ways as well, and particularly around the carbon agenda. BEIS, for example, are very interested in biomass and looking at how we can develop a strategy towards using biomass in a sustainable way. Obviously, that has a land use bearing on it. So I think we need to be able to respond to those sorts of demands within DEFRA. And likewise in Department for Transport, there's and BEIS in terms of energy production, there's an interest in carbon offsetting and such like. So tree planting is high on the agenda, and we need to understand how that trades off with agriculture in particular. So it's worth noting that we have, in terms of the system that we're intervening with here, we've got a number of levers at our disposal. We can issue guidance, we can provide direct advice to farmers. We have a number of incentive schemes, some of which I've mentioned through grant schemes and agri-environment schemes, and we have regulation in terms of rules and regulations that farmers have to comply with, and foresters, I should say. And we also have the trade discussions, which are obviously ongoing at the moment, which James touched on a bit in his presentation. All of them influencing land management actions, which we don't have direct control over, but we're interested in understanding what the implications of land use changes are. And I think we're pretty good at doing that from a modelling perspective. Where I feel like we probably need a bit more is around sort of land management interventions, and particularly where you get into detail farm and field scale interventions around soil and water management. So what are the implications of minimum tillage, for example, or different resource use interventions around slurry and manure management, for example, or the sort of field scale agri-environment options, which we are trying to promote through schemes like the current countryside stewardship scheme and the new environmental land management schemes that we're designing at the moment. So cover crops, tramline management, skylark plots, those sorts of things. And then we have a huge range of outputs or outcomes that we're interested in as well, which derive primarily from the 25-year environment plan, but we've got a number of other interests within the departments as well. Obviously, economic growth at the moment is high on the agenda. From a food systems perspective, health and well-being, food security, nutrition, those sorts of topics we need to understand as well. We are looking at different scales within the DEFRA group more generally, and Pam and I are working really, I guess, at a national scale in terms of advising on national policy development, working with the team in the kind of head office of DEFRA. But we also have we also have regional and local teams in our arm's length bodies in the Environment Agency, in Natural England and Forestry Commission, who have an interest in landscape and catchment scale decision making, and also looking at the farm scale, working directly with farmers in some cases. All right, this is quite a simplistic sort of way of looking at it, but I think it's quite helpful. We sometimes talk about policy making as a cyclical process. I don't think it actually works in that way. I think it's messier and more opportunistic and such like. But these four elements exist, and I think there are questions that we need help with in each of those stages. First is around target setting and prioritization. So this is around setting targets for individual policies. So if you think about the Environment Bill at the moment, we're setting targets for various environmental outcomes around air quality and water quality and such like. We need to be able to understand what's realistic. We also need to be able to balance expectations between policy areas. If we set a particular target for air, what does it mean for water and for soil and for other things? And we need to play around with scenarios as well. And I think James touched on some of that within his presentation too. So what is going to happen anyway in the absence of our policies as a result of Brexit, as a result of what's going on globally in terms of the economic situation resulting from COVID and that sort of thing. The second area is what I've called solution spaces here, but what I mean really here is about sort of what the actual physical land use, land management changes which we need to happen on the ground to deliver these targets and priorities, both at national and local scales. So what are the specific land use, land management changes which are needed to achieve our outcomes? And you can also think about this the other way around. You know, if we come up with a solution of a selection of interventions or things that we're paying for example, through agri-environment schemes, what are the outcomes we can expect to get from that? Thirdly, you enter this quite complex socioeconomic dimension at the bottom, which is around policy design. You know, we have a rather limited toolkit in terms of ways in which we can intervene with farming and land use, and some of those levers are pretty powerful. Some of them are a little bit weaker. We need to be able to understand how those levers influence land managers' decision making, and how do they fit in within a wider context of other drivers and other things that influence what influences farmers. So which could include things like, you know, farm tenancy agreements and wider economic factors and tradition and various other things like that. And finally, I think, and James talked about this a little bit as well, but the sort of modelling in the context of evaluation, this is incredibly important, and it's something which is very difficult for us to do. Now, we have a range of policy interventions which aim to do things like reverse the downward trend in farmland birds, for example, but disentangling the effects of those policy interventions and generating cost-benefit information which can be used to then sort of reinforce the case for those interventions and to design better interventions is really quite difficult. There are so many other factors at play in terms of driving these environmental outcomes. So very broadly, I think this sort of I won't go into this in too much detail, but effectively we want models which allow us to look at course land use change and changes in farm management practices and understand trade-offs in 25-year plan goals. we need to be able to work the other way around in terms of looking at 25-year goals and doing, perhaps optimization is the wrong word here, but looking at which land use and management options are kind of sit within the Pareto front, probably, in terms of optimal solutions. We need to understand the effects of external drivers on land use and management, and look at the effectiveness of policy interventions on land manager behaviour. I've listed a few priorities here, and again, conscious of time and wanting to leave plenty of time for Pam. Just to run through these quickly, I think we probably need more in terms of understanding this social side of this. We're quite good on the biophysical side in terms of modelling capability. How do we integrate that sort of socioeconomic aspects into it? Land management practices at the kind of field and farm scale. You know, what's the difference between a 6 metre buffer strip and a 12 metre buffer strip, for example? That sort of detail is quite difficult. We've got some tools, but I think we need probably a bit more. Cost and benefit, obviously we need to be able to put numbers and costs behind what we're doing. Model integration and interoperability. We've got a lot of tools which we draw on at the moment, but you know, can we develop the sorts of platforms which James presented, which allow us to use tools in combination to answer different types of questions? I think there's a general challenge around model validation and quality assurance, and I think we would like the modelling community to be able to kind of come together and work together on standards for modelling and particularly around sort of quality assurance. How can we be reassured that the models that we're using are robust? And actually, the last point here I think is actually the most important, which is around co-design and co-development. We don't want the academic community to go off and do this on their own. We want to be part of the process, and particularly in terms of designing those decision trees which feed into the modelling process. So I think we need some sort of forum for co-design, and particularly if we're working with the UKRI community on model development and trying to develop tools which are useful for policy making. We have some challenges in terms of using models within the DEFRA group, which I should probably draw out here. One is time. We just, you know, we're all kind of trying to do lots of things at the same time, so we don't actually have a lot of analysts with a lot of time who can get into the detail of this. One is actually around IT. We have rather kind of secure IT systems in DEFRA and in government in general, which makes it quite difficult to run software which has been developed externally. So that is a challenge for us. And the final area is around real-time decision making. We often have to make decisions very quickly, so we need modelling platforms which are able to provide us quick answers to quick questions. So with that, I'll hand over to Pam. And Pam, just let me know when you want me to click the slides on.
Okay, thank you, Dan. So Dan's covered many of the issues that DEFRA faces in terms of landscape modelling, and he's sort of set the broad policy context. So what I want to do is to take perhaps a little bit of a sort of deeper dive on the policy side. And these are some of the sort of questions that are often asked by sort of policy makers, and some of these are being covered by James as well. But I particularly want to think about, you know, specific interventions for a particular policy outcome and how a specific intervention may lead to a whole variety of outcomes. And then there's the question of how do you deal with the synergies and trade-offs that might occur. Next slide. So you're well aware that net zero is a firm commitment of the UK government, and while land use and natural resources are an important sink of greenhouse gas emissions, significant reductions are required from agricultural emissions in order to help meet the net zero target. And here there are a number of interventions that can be taken, but the interventions will have impacts with the agri-food system. But as Dan's talked about in terms of other government departments like BEIS and their biomass strategy, and looking at carbon sequestration, a lot of demand is being put on land to provide offsetting, and therefore there's a need to be able to look at the possible different potential uses of land, and we urgently need tools to develop, you know, plausible futures which are consistent not only with the net zero target but with also the desires and goals of the 25-year environmental plan. Next slide, please. So, I mean, at the moment, the carbon budgets are being set in order to meet the net zero target, but there are a number of different ways in which those carbon budgets could be achieved. So for DEFRA, the carbon budget really, and the questions revolve around understanding the sort of environmental or biophysical processes that affect the cycling of carbon and the storage of carbon and affect the functioning of land. But they also involve a strong social and economic component which affect land use management and land use decision making. There are obviously wider interactions with natural capital that may need to be taken into account as well, because these will affect the 25-year environment plan targets. And there's also the potential trade-off with food. So already we're into a certain sort of complexity and a need to look at a number of different ways of achieving net zero. So again, we're back to the question as how might a specific intervention achieve a particular desired policy outcome, or what might be the multiple outcomes of a specific intervention. Next slide. So one of the proposed interventions for achieving net zero is peatland restoration. And in some workshops with a wide range of stakeholders, we asked them to identify the environmental, social and economic impacts of peatland restoration. And these are the sort of systems maps that we've come up with. So, for example, down in the bottom left-hand corner, we have a number of environmental impacts that could result from peatland restoration. And here I should say that the blue lines indicate where a particular variable could lead to a sort of positive or an increase in the variable to which the arrow is going, whereas the red ones indicate a decrease. So if one variable increases, the other decreases. So we're starting to get into ideas of feedback, causal loop mapping. So certainly there are a large number of environmental impacts. There are also economic impacts. If Dan can press. Yes, there are a number of things around job creation and around rural economy. There are also social impacts of peatland restoration in terms of communities and farmers. And then there's also the health and well-being. So I think here you can see how just one intervention has multiple potential outcomes, a number of places where policy levers could be implemented. We move on to the next slide. We also looked at salt marsh restoration as it's part of climate change mitigation, but also important action for climate adaptation, both of those being part of one of the 5-year environment plan goals. And here, as one says, just for illustrative purposes only, we mapped a selection of key UK and EU marine biodiversity policies onto the systems map that we had drawn. And here, even with taking only 4 key policy areas, you can see how a particular policy can influence a number of different parts of the system, but also you can see how any given variable can be influenced by several different policies. And if we populated this map with all the policies affecting salt marsh restoration, we'd have a map covered with policies and with circles. So I think this just helps to illustrate how we're dealing with really sort of complex systems. And I suppose one of the questions is, how far can we use modelling to help us look at all these various different impacts that a given policy intervention might have, and look at all the multiple policies that might impact an intervention. Next slide, please. So in sort of conclusion, or perhaps in sort of summing up, I think what we've tried to show is the sort of complex and uncertain space in which we're operating, which I'm sure you're all aware of. And this complexity and uncertainty comes, for example, from the multiple objectives we're often trying to deal with, the multiple outcomes perhaps that are trying to be achieved, or sometimes there are unintended outcomes. We're dealing with multiple values, and these needn't necessarily just be economic values, but they can be more social values. And we're dealing with multiple actors. And I'm sure there are many other multiples that I've missed out. And this multiplicity of objectives, outcomes, values, and actors means that you get synergies and trade-offs between them. So there's a question of how do you capture these synergies and trade-offs, and how do you handle them? And these synergies and trade-offs also mean that decisions need to be able to work across scales, across sectors, and across policies. So if we're to have more integrated landscape decision making, all these elements need to be taken into account. Next slide, please. So with that, we're going to finish, and hopefully you can help us unravel this spaghetti and achieve some more coherent decision making in the context of landscapes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pam and Dan. Lots and lots of food for thought there, not just me staring at spaghetti now. But yeah, your slides on research priorities will be massively helpful, particularly when we go into breakout group discussions on Thursday during the workshop, and we will definitely refer to those. We're running a little bit behind schedule, but I'd like to just take a couple of the questions from the Slido chat that have come through. There's one from Felix Eigenbrod, which was a question on do you ever use the models and the tools that you have available to you to backcast, to try and assess the effectiveness of the individual policy levers and try and disentangle some of the issues you were raising?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the key challenges we have is trying to, and particularly when we're trying to evaluate the cost effectiveness of the interventions that we've put in place. You know, we want evidence that the policies that we're designing and implementing are having an effect on the things that they're supposed to be having an effect on. So yes, we do try and do that, but I think it's very difficult, and I think we would like to have a sort of more robust toolkit of approaches to help us to do that. Great,
thanks, Dan. And then another question we got in from Nick Search, who likes the idea you mentioned about developing modelling standards, particularly for models that help to inform policy. I just wondered if you had any more information on how you might think we could define those and how that might link with the need for models and test data to be very much open access and in the public domain.
I think this is something which would need a extended discussion, probably with this community actually, in terms of how we do that. You know, providing open access to coding, for example, might be one thing. We might have to have some standards around how we parameterize and test with the effectiveness of models, for example. I don't know really, and I think it's something which I'd really like a conversation on at some stage.
Okay, maybe that's the one that we should take into our breakout groups and workshops, and then we can iterate with you if some solutions or suggestions emerge. Brilliant.
Sounds good.
Great. So thanks again, Dan and Pam, for your valuable contribution.